Picture the sky turning completely black, not from storm clouds, but from the wings of over 4,000 aircraft and gliders blotting out the autumn sun. It is September 1944, and the Allied war machine is about to roll the iron dice in the largest airborne operation in human history. 50,000 elite paratroopers, the absolute tip of the Allied spear, are strapping into their harnesses, preparing to hurl themselves out of perfectly good aeroplanes and into the teeth of the German war machine. This is Operation Market Garden, a breathtakingly audacious gamble designed to punch a hole straight through the Netherlands, outflank the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine River, and end the Second World War by Christmas. But as any seasoned military strategist will tell you, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, especially when that enemy is backed into a corner and fighting for its very survival. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the firepower, and the brutal realities of history's greatest conflicts. If you want to understand the grim mechanics of warfare and the decisions that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and sound off in the comments below with what battle you want us to tear apart next. Now let us drop into the European theatre and examine the massive logistical, strategic, and tactical chessboard that set the stage for this legendary airborne assault. To understand why the Allies decided to drop tens of thousands of lightly armed paratroopers 64 miles behind enemy lines, we have to rewind the clock and look at the brutal mathematics of logistics. By late August 1944, the Allied armies had broken out of the Normandy beachhead, shattered the German 7th Army at the Falaise Pocket, and were racing across France at a breakneck pace. General George S. Patton's Third Army was tearing through the countryside like a runaway freight train, while British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces were pushing north toward Belgium. The German army in the west was in full retreat, disorganized, demoralized, and seemingly on the verge of total collapse. But the Allies were about to hit a brick wall, and it was not made of German concrete, but of supply lines. How do you feed, fuel, and rearm a mechanized behemoth of over 2 million men when your only working ports are hundreds of miles behind you in Normandy? The answer is, you struggle, and eventually, you stop. The Allied logistical tether had stretched to its absolute breaking point. Cherbourg, the primary deep-water port, was over 400 miles from the front lines. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive fleet of nearly 6,000 supply trucks, driven largely by tireless African-American quartermaster troops, was running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These men were pushing themselves and their 2.5-ton trucks to the absolute limit, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily. But the brutal irony of mechanized logistics is that it costs fuel to deliver fuel. The Red Bull trucks were burning up to 300,000 gallons of gasoline a day just to transport the fuel the tanks needed to keep moving. An M4 Sherman tank gets roughly 1 to 1.5 miles to the gallon, and an entire armored division devours tens of thousands of gallons in a single day of combat operations. The Allied advance was literally running out of gas. This logistical nightmare created a massive strategic dispute at the highest levels of Allied command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, favored a broad front strategy, pushing all armies forward simultaneously to stretch the German defenses and prevent them from concentrating their forces. It was a methodical, conservative approach, reminiscent of Ulysses S. Grant's relentless, grinding pressure on Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in 1864, where overwhelming resources and parallel advances slowly strangled the enemy. But Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, vehemently disagreed. Montgomery wanted a single, concentrated, pencil-like thrust in the north. He argued that if Eisenhower gave him absolute priority on all supplies and logistics, he could smash through the German lines, cross the Rhine, and drive straight into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Adding to Montgomery's argument was intense political pressure from London. The Germans had begun launching V-2 ballistic missiles from launch sites in the Netherlands, raining terror down on British civilians. The British government desperately wanted those launch sites overrun. Furthermore, the Allies had a massive, highly trained and expensive asset sitting idle in England: the First Allied Airborne Army. Commanded by American Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton, this massive force of paratroopers and glider infantry had been preparing for multiple drops across France, only to have them cancelled time and time again because the rapidly advancing ground troops kept overrunning the drop zones before the planes could even take off. Paratroopers are the most expensive, highly trained infantry in any military, and having them sit in barracks drinking tea while the war was being won was politically and militarily unacceptable. The pressure to use them was immense. Montgomery's plan, which Eisenhower eventually approved in a rare moment of compromise, was split into two distinct phases: Market and Garden. Operation Market was the airborne assault. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, under the command of Major General Maxwell Taylor, would drop in the south to seize the bridges around Eindhoven. North of them, the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, commanded by the brilliant and aggressive Brigadier General James Gavin, would drop to capture the vital bridges at Grave and Nijmegen. Finally, at the very tip of the spear, the British 1st Airborne Division, under Major General Roy Urquhart, supported by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, under Major General Stanisław Sosabowski, would drop at the northernmost objective to seize the massive bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem. Operation Garden was the ground assault. The British 33rd Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, would act as the armoured battering ram. Their job was to punch through the German front lines, drive up a single two-lane highway, and relieve the airborne forces holding the bridges, one by one. The timeline was brutally strict. Den Corps had to reach the 101st on day 1, the 82nd by day 2, and the British at Arnhem by day 3 or 4 at the latest. It was a concept known as an airborne carpet, laying down paratroopers to hold open a corridor for the heavy armour to roll over. It was a breathtakingly complex plan, relying on perfect timing, perfect weather, and most importantly, a completely shattered enemy. But the plan had a fatal flaw, rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the terrain and a catastrophic failure of military intelligence. Let us talk about the battlefield. The Netherlands is not tank country. It is a series of polders, low-lying tracts of land enclosed by dikes, intersected by countless canals, ditches and rivers. The ground is soft, muddy, and completely incapable of supporting the weight of a 30-ton Sherman tank. Because of this, the roads in the Netherlands are elevated, built on top of dikes. For 30 Corps, this meant their entire armoured column, tens of thousands of vehicles, would be confined to a single, elevated two-lane road stretching for 64 miles. In military terminology, this is known as a defile. It is a tank commander's absolute worst nightmare. If a single vehicle at the front of the column is knocked out, the entire advance stops dead until the wreckage is pushed off the steep embankments. There is no room to maneuver, no room to deploy into combat formations, and no way to outflank an ambush. It is a 64-mile-long shooting gallery. Compare this to the brutal terrain of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, where American forces were funneled into dense forests and ravines, suffering horrific casualties because they could not maneuver their heavy assets. The terrain itself dictates the tactics, and in Operation Market Garden, the terrain heavily favored the defender. Now let us examine the staggering correlation of forces, starting with the hammer, the Allied Airborne Armada. To drop 50,000 men behind enemy lines requires an industrial effort that boggles the mind. The backbone of this lift was the Douglas C-47 Skytrain. This twin-engine transport aircraft, powered by two Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engines, was the unglamorous workhorse that made the entire operation possible. With a cruising speed of 160 miles per hour and a range of 1,600 miles, the C-47 could carry 28 fully equipped paratroopers, or up to 6,000 pounds of cargo. For Market Garden, the Allies assembled a staggering fleet of over 1,400 C-47s, alongside hundreds of British bombers converted for towing duties. But paratroopers alone cannot hold a bridge against heavy armor. They need anti-tank guns, jeeps, and heavy artillery. To move these assets, the Allies relied on gliders, specifically the American Waco CG-4A and the massive British airspeed Horsa. The Horsa was a wooden behemoth capable of carrying a jeep and a 75mm pack howitzer, or up to 30 fully armed troops. The Waco could carry a quarter-ton jeep, or 13 men. Flying a glider into combat is essentially a controlled crash. Made of canvas, plywood, and steel tubing, these unpowered aircraft had no armor and no second chances. Once released from their tow planes, the glider pilots had to find a clear patch of ground, dodge anti-aircraft fire, avoid wooden stakes driven into the fields by the Germans, and slam their aircraft into the dirt, hoping the cargo did not break loose and crush them upon impact. The men jumping out of these aircraft were the finest light infantry the United States had ever produced. The American paratrooper in 1944 was a heavily burdened, highly lethal operator. General James Gavin, the commander of the 82nd Airborne, was only 37 years old, the youngest major general to command an American division in World War II. Gavin was a pioneer of airborne doctrine, a man who believed in leading from the front, literally jumping out of the lead aircraft with an M1 Garand rifle in his hands. His men were equipped with the best gear American industry could provide. The standard weapon was the M1 Garand, a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle firing the hard-hitting .30-06 Springfield cartridge. With its 8-round on-block clip, the Garand gave the American paratrooper a massive volume of fire advantage over the bolt-action rifles used by the average German infantryman. Close-quarters combat was handled by the Thompson submachine gun, firing heavy .45 caliber slugs, or the M1A1 carbine, a lightweight folding stock weapon designed specifically for airborne troops. But jumping out of a plane with all this gear was a physical ordeal. An American paratrooper wore the T5 parachute assembly, which opened via a static line hooked to a cable inside the aircraft. When the paratrooper leaped out the door, the static line pulled the parachute out of its pack, deploying the canopy in seconds. The shock of the opening was violent, often bruising the men. On top of the main chute and the reserve chute strapped to their chest, paratroopers carried up to 100 pounds of gear, including ammunition, grenades, rations, medical kits, and anti-tank mines. Many men were so heavy they had to be pushed up into the aircraft by their buddies. To carry heavier weapons like machine guns or mortars, they used a leg bag, a heavy canvas sack strapped to the jumper's leg. The doctrine called for the jumper to release the leg bag on a 20-foot rope just before hitting the ground to reduce his landing weight. But the violent opening shock of the parachute frequently snapped the ropes, sending vital heavy weapons plummeting into the swamps below, leaving the men armed only with their rifles and whatever they had in their pockets. But what happens when you drop lightly armed infantry, carrying only what they can strap to their bodies, into a hornet's nest of heavy armor? This brings us to the anvil, the German military machine. Allied intelligence had convinced Montgomery and his staff that the German army in the Netherlands was composed of old men, Hitler Youth, and shattered remnants fleeing from France. They believed the Germans lacked the command structure, the armor, and the willpower to mount a cohesive defense. This was a catastrophic intelligence failure, rivaling the British underestimation of the Turkish defenders at Gallipoli in 1915. The Allies ignored ultra-intercepts that hinted at German armor in the area, and they blatantly dismissed aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by British intelligence officer Major Brian Urquhart, which clearly showed German tanks hidden in the woods around Arnhem. The reality on the ground was far deadlier than Montgomery wanted to admit. Commanding the German defense was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recently recalled by Hitler to command OB West. Rundstedt was an old-school Prussian aristocrat, a master of operational defense. But the man pulling the tactical strings on the ground in the Netherlands was Field Marshal Walther Model, commanding Army Group B. Model was known as the Fireman of the Reich, a ruthless, energetic commander who specialized in stabilizing collapsing fronts. Model had a genius for scraping together disparate units, logistics personnel, mechanics, and shattered infantry companies, and forging them into highly effective combat teams known as Kampfgruppers. German military doctrine relied heavily on Auftragstaktik, or mission command. This philosophy empowered junior officers and even non-commissioned officers to take immediate, independent action to achieve the commander's intent without waiting for orders from high command. When the Allied paratroopers landed, the Germans would not wait for a coordinated counterattack plan to be drawn up in Berlin. They would react instantly, aggressively, and with extreme violence. Worse still for the Allies, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, was resting and refitting in the exact area the British 1st Airborne Division was scheduled to drop. This corps consisted of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. While it is true these divisions had been badly mauled in Normandy and were operating at a fraction of their authorized strength, a depleted panzer division is still a heavily armed, mechanized killing machine. They possessed Panther tanks, arguably one of the best medium tanks of the war. The Panther weighed 45 tons, featured 80 mm of sloped frontal armor, and mounted the deadly KWK 42 75mm L/70 gun. This high-velocity weapon could punch through the armor of an Allied Sherman tank at a range of over a mile. For an American or British paratrooper armed only with a bazooka or a Piat anti-tank projector, facing a Panther was a virtual death sentence. The bazooka fired a shaped charge rocket that could penetrate armor, but its effective range was dangerously short, and it required the operator to hit the tank in its vulnerable side or rear armor. The German infantry was also heavily equipped with the MG-42 machine gun. Known as Hitler's buzzsaw, this weapon fired at a terrifying rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, sounding like ripping canvas. A single MG-42 positioned at a crossroad or overlooking a bridge could lock down an entire paratrooper battalion. The German industrial capacity, directed by Albert Speer, had actually reached its peak production in late 1944, despite relentless Allied strategic bombing. They were still churning out tanks, artillery, and ammunition. Their critical weakness was not a lack of weapons, but a lack of fuel, as Allied bombers had systematically destroyed their synthetic oil plants. But in a static, defensive battle like the one about to unfold in the Netherlands, fuel shortages were less critical. The German tanks did not need to drive hundreds of miles. They just needed to drive a few miles down the road, park at a strategic choke point, and wait for the lightly armoured Allied forces to come to them. The trap was set. The Allies, blinded by their own optimism and desperate to end the war, had drawn up a plan that relied on absolute precision, ignoring the friction of war and the resilience of a cornered enemy. On the morning of September 17, 1944, the fog finally lifted over the airfields of England. The massive Wright Cyclone and Pratt & Whitney engines of thousands of transport planes coughed, sputtered, and roared to life, sending a deafening thunder across the countryside. Inside the fuselages, 50,000 men checked their weapons, adjusted their heavy harnesses, and stared silently at the metal floors, listening to the roar of the engines as they lifted off the runway and pointed their noses toward the Dutch coast. The airborne armada was in the air, the point of no return had been crossed, and the Screaming Eagles and the All-Americans were flying straight into the jaws of a heavily armoured buzzsaw waiting for them on the ground. The moment the green light flashed inside the C-47 transport planes, the sky over the Netherlands became a canvas of controlled chaos. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon on September 17th, the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions stepped out of the doors into the brutal reality of the prop blast. Plunging at 150 miles per hour, the men experienced a violent jolt as their static lines pulled the silk canopies from their packs. They were dropping from an altitude of barely 500 to 1,000 feet, leaving them dangling in the air for a terrifyingly brief window of less than 60 seconds before slamming into the Dutch dirt. Why jump from such a dangerously low altitude when enemy anti-aircraft guns are waiting below? The brutal mathematics of an airborne drop dictate that the longer a man is in the air, the further he drifts from his target and the wider the dispersion of the unit on the ground. To secure a bridge, you need concentrated combat power immediately, not scattered riflemen wandering for hours looking for their platoons. But this low-altitude strategy meant the transport planes and the descending paratroopers were flying directly into the teeth of German 20mm flak-Vierling 38 anti-aircraft guns. These quad-barreled weapons fired high-explosive incendiary tracer rounds at a cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute. The unarmoured C-47s, flying in tight V formations, took devastating hits, with engines catching fire and wings shearing off. Yet the pilots held their courses with iron discipline until the last paratrooper had cleared the door. Down on the ground, Major General Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, hit their drop zones north of Eindhoven with remarkable precision. Their objective was straightforward on paper, but agonizingly complex in execution. Secure 15 miles of the highway and capture several bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal, the Aar River, and the Dommel River. Taylor's men quickly shed their harnesses, assembled their weapons, and moved out. The 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment pushed rapidly toward the crucial bridge at Sonne. But as they approached the canal, the fatal flaw of relying on lightly armed infantry to capture heavily defended infrastructure revealed itself. The German defenders, a cobbled-together force of rear-echelon troops and anti-aircraft crews, had rigged the bridge with heavy explosives. As the lead elements of the 506 rushed the span, the Germans detonated the charges. With a deafening roar, the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal blew sky-high, sending chunks of concrete and twisted steel raining down on the American paratroopers. The airborne carpet had just been ripped right down the middle on day one. How do you cross a destroyed bridge when your entire armored relief column is scheduled to drive over it in less than 24 hours? You rely on the unsung heroes of the battlefield, the combat engineers. The destruction of the Somme Bridge forced the Americans to wait for the British 33rd Corps to arrive with heavy bridging equipment. This brings us to a marvel of military engineering, the Bailey Bridge. Designed by a British civil servant, the Bailey Bridge was a portable, prefabricated truss bridge that required no special tools or heavy equipment to assemble. It was constructed of interchangeable steel panels, transoms and stringers pinned together by hand. A well-trained engineer company could build a bridge capable of supporting a 40-ton tank in a matter of hours, pushing the assembled sections over the gap on rollers. But building a bridge takes time, and time was the one commodity the Allies did not have. The delay at Somme cost the operation a critical 12 hours, a delay that would ripple up the highway with devastating consequences. This engineering bottleneck is highly reminiscent of the Union Army's struggles during the American Civil War, specifically the crossing of the James River in 1864. General Ulysses S. Grant's engineers constructed a massive pontoon bridge over 2,000 feet long in just 8 hours to move his army, proving that mobility in warfare is completely dictated by the speed at which your engineers can overcome water obstacles. In the Netherlands, the water obstacles were everywhere, and the German defenders knew exactly how to exploit them. While the 101st was dealing with blown bridges and fierce localized counterattacks, Brigadier General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, had dropped further north. Gavin's objectives were arguably the most difficult of the entire American sector. He had to capture the massive bridge over the Maas River at Grave, secure the high ground east of Nijmegen, known as the Groesbeek Heights, to block German armoured counterattacks streaming in from the Reichswald forest, and capture the colossal highway bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. Gavin, jumping with his men, immediately directed the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment to secure the Grave Bridge. In a textbook coup de main, a company of the 504th dropped literally hundreds of yards from the bridge, overwhelmed the stunned German flak crews, and secured the massive span intact. It was a brilliant tactical success, but the victory was short-lived as Gavin looked toward his primary headache, the Groesbeek Heights. Gavin knew that if he did not hold this high ground, German tanks could roll right over his division and cut the highway. He was forced to commit the bulk of his combat power to defending the woods and ridges, leaving him with insufficient forces to immediately rush the Nijmegen Bridge. This tactical dilemma highlights the fundamental weakness of airborne operations, a severe lack of heavy anti-tank weapons. The standard American anti-tank weapon for the airborne was the M1A1 bazooka. This shoulder-fired weapon utilized a shaped charge warhead, relying on the Monroe effect to penetrate armor. When the warhead detonated, an inverted copper cone inside the explosive was superheated and inverted into a high-velocity jet of molten metal that could burn through roughly 3 to 4 inches of steel. While effective against light armor and half-tracks, The bazooka struggled against the thick, sloped frontal armor of German medium tanks like the Panzer IV or the Panther. The paratroopers had to rely on stealth, flanking maneuvers, and point-blank ambushes to hit the tanks in their thinner side or rear armor. Furthermore, the 82nd Airborne was waiting for their glider lifts to bring in their heavier 57mm anti-tank guns and 75mm pack howitzers. But here, the weather, the eternal enemy of the aviator, intervened. A massive fog bank rolled over the airfields in England, grounding the second lift. Gavin's men were left clinging to the Grosbeak heights, fighting off probing attacks from German armor, critically short on heavy weapons, and watching the clock tick as they waited for the armored cavalry of 30th Corps to arrive. Speaking of the cavalry, let us shift our focus to the ground assault, Operation Garden. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon on September 17th, the earth shook as a massive British artillery barrage pounded the German positions just across the Dutch border. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, standing in his command vehicle, gave the order to advance. The spearhead of 10th Tenthi Corps was the Irish Guards Armoured Division. Their designated route was a single, elevated two-lane road that would soon earn the grim moniker Hell's Highway. The armoured column stretched for miles, a massive steel serpent of Sherman tanks, Cromwell tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks. The point vehicle was a Sherman Firefly, arguably the most lethal tank in the British arsenal. The Firefly was a standard American M4 Sherman, modified by the British to carry the devastating 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This weapon fired a specialized armor-piercing discarding sabot round, or APDS, at a muzzle velocity of nearly 3,000 feet per second. The 17-pounder could punch clean through the frontal armor of a German Tiger tank at 1,000 yards. The Germans feared the Firefly so much that their tank commanders were explicitly ordered to target them first in any engagement. But all the firepower in the world is useless if you cannot maneuver, and the Irish Guards were about to learn a bloody lesson in terrain restriction. As the lead tanks crossed the border and rolled toward the town of Valkenswaard, they entered a kill zone. The road was flanked by soft, boggy ditches, making it impossible for the tanks to pull off the pavement. Waiting in the woods flanking the road were elements of a hastily assembled German Kampfgruppe, armed with the deadly Panzerfaust. What makes a simple infantryman brave enough to stand his ground against a 30-ton tank? The answer is a weapon that levels the playing field. The Panzerfaust 60 was a single-use, recoilless anti-tank weapon firing a massive shaped-charge warhead. It had an effective range of only 60 meters, requiring the German infantryman to hold his nerve and wait until the tank was practically on top of him. When fired, the backblast was lethal, but the warhead could penetrate an astonishing 8 inches of armor. Suddenly, the tree line erupted in fire and smoke. Panzerfaust warheads slammed into the lead British tanks. The explosions were catastrophic. When a shaped charge penetrates a tank, it sends a jet of superheated metal and spalling armor into the crew compartment, instantly igniting the ammunition and fuel. In a matter of minutes, 9 British tanks were destroyed, brewing up into towering pillars of black smoke and fire. The entire advance of 30 Corps ground to a violent halt. The tanks behind the burning wreckage could not move forward, and they could not pull off the road without sinking up to their tracks in the Dutch mud. The infantry had to dismount, wade through the ditches, and clear the woods in brutal close-quarters combat. It took hours to secure the area, bulldoze the burning tanks off the elevated road, and resume the advance. This was the Defile effect in pure, unadulterated action. It was a logistical and tactical nightmare, echoing the bloody struggles of the Union Army in the dense, restrictive terrain of the Wilderness Campaign in 1864, where superior numbers meant absolutely nothing because the terrain channeled the fighting into narrow, deadly funnels. 10th Corps was bleeding time, and time was the only thing the paratroopers holding the bridges did not have. By September 19th, the third day of the operation, the situation at Nijmegen had become critical. The 82nd Airborne, finally linked up with the lead elements of 30 Corps, still had not captured the massive highway bridge over the Vaal River. The German defenders, reinforced by SS troops, had turned the approaches to the bridge into a fortress of interlocking machine gun fire, 88mm anti-tank guns, and barbed wire. General Gavin realized that a frontal assault across the bridge was suicide. He needed to outflank the defenders. He proposed a plan so audacious and incredibly dangerous that it bordered on madness. An amphibious assault across the Vaal River, a fast-flowing body of water 400 yards wide, in broad daylight. The objective was to cross the river downstream, assault the northern bank, and seize the northern end of the bridge, trapping the German defenders. The task fell to Major Julian Cook and the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. But there was a massive problem. The paratroopers did not have any boats. They had to wait for 1010's Corps logistics trucks stuck in the monstrous traffic jam on Hell's Highway to bring forward 26 canvas assault boats. These were not armoured landing craft, they were essentially collapsible canvas bathtubs with a plywood bottom, 19 feet long, designed to carry 13 men. They offered absolutely zero ballistic protection. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the boats finally arrived. The paratroopers of the 504th dragged the heavy, awkward boats to the water's edge under a smoke screen. But as the wind shifted, the smoke blew away, exposing the Americans perfectly on the riverbank. Across the 400 yards of open water, German MG-42 machine guns, 20mm flak cannons, and mortar crews opened up with everything they had. The water churned and boiled with bullet impacts. What possesses a man to paddle a canvas bathtub into the teeth of interlocking machine gun fire? It is a combination of iron discipline, loyalty to the men next to them, and the cold realization that the only way out of the kill zone is forward. The crossing of the Vaal River by the 504th PIR stands as one of the most brutal and heroic feats of arms in American military history. As the men pushed off into the fast-flowing current, the slaughter began. Mortar shells scored direct hits on the fragile boats, vaporizing them in geysers of water and blood. Machine gun fire ripped through the canvas, sinking boats and sending heavily laden paratroopers plunging into the deep water, where their heavy gear dragged them straight to the bottom. Many boats did not even have enough paddles, forcing the paratroopers to paddle frantically with the butts of their M1 Garand rifles. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of roaring artillery, ripping canvas, screaming men, and the relentless mechanical buzzsaw of the MG-42s. This daylight amphibious assault against fortified positions draws a chilling parallel to the Union assault at Fredericksburg in 1862, where engineers and infantry tried to cross the Rappahannock River in pontoon boats under a hail of Confederate sharpshooter fire. The casualty rates were horrific, but the sheer unstoppable momentum of the American paratroopers could not be denied. Of the 26 boats that started the crossing, only 11 made it to the northern bank. The moment the keels scraped the mud, the surviving paratroopers, completely soaked, exhausted, and enraged, did not stop to regroup. They charged straight up the embankments, firing their soaked weapons and throwing grenades into the German trenches. The ferocity of the American assault shocked the German defenders. In brutal hand-to-hand combat, the 504th cleared the northern bank, captured the northern end of the highway bridge, and finally allowed the British armour of Death Corps to roll across the Vaal River. The Nijmegen Bridge was secure, but the cost was staggering. Over 200 American paratroopers were killed or wounded in the river crossing alone. General Gavin, watching the assault from the southern bank, wept as he saw the bodies of his men floating in the bloody water. The hammer had struck, the anvil had held, and the airborne carpet had been laid, albeit torn and blooded. The 101st had secured the southern sector, and the 82nd, at a terrible cost, had secured the Vaal River crossing. The British armour was finally across the river and poised for the final sprint. But the entire strategic premise of Operation Market Garden relied on all three bridges being held. While the Americans fought for their lives in the south, a much darker, far more desperate drama was unfolding 60 miles behind enemy lines at the very tip of the spear. The British 1st Airborne Division had dropped into Arnhem, expecting a light defence. Instead, they had landed squarely on top of two resting SS Panzer divisions. The radio networks had failed, the resupply drops were falling into German hands, and the lightly armed British paratroopers were being systematically ground to dust by heavy German armour. The question was no longer whether 1010 Corps could reach Arnhem to win the war, but whether they could reach Arnhem in time to save the British paratroopers from total annihilation. The tragedy unfolding in the narrow streets of Arnhem was a brutal testament to the limitations of light infantry when stripped of their mobility and forced to stand against heavy armour. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and the roughly 740 men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion had managed to secure the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge, but they were entirely cut off from the rest of the British 1st Airborne Division. Surrounding them were the rapidly mobilising elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. This was not the shattered, demoralised German army that Allied intelligence had promised. These were hardened combat veterans, and they were bringing massive mechanised firepower to bear on paratroopers hiding in brick houses. The Germans deployed the terrifying Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung B, universally known as the Tiger II or King Tiger tank. Weighing in at an earth-shattering 68 tons, the King Tiger was a steel leviathan. Its frontal armour was 150 millimeters thick and heavily sloped, making it virtually impervious to any anti-tank weapon in the Allied arsenal, let alone the man-portable weapons carried by paratroopers. It mounted the dreaded 88mm KWK 43L/71 gun, a weapon of such extreme velocity and destructive power that it could punch through a Sherman tank at ranges exceeding 2 miles. How do you fight a 68-ton monster when your heaviest weapon is a spring-loaded pipe? The British paratroopers were armed with the Piat, or projector infantry anti-tank. Unlike the American bazooka, which used a rocket motor, the Piat was a spigot mortar that used a massive steel spring to launch a 3-pound shaped charge bomb. It was heavy, awkward, had a punishing recoil, and its effective range was a pathetic 100 yards. Against the side or rear armour of a lighter vehicle, it could be lethal, but against a King Tiger, it was like throwing rocks at a battleship. The German tanks simply parked out of range of the Piats and systematically levelled the buildings housing the British defenders, blasting them to rubble, brick by brick, with high-explosive 88mm shells. This localized tactical slaughter at the bridge highlights the most glaring strategic lesson of Operation Market Garden: the absolute peril of confirmation bias in military intelligence. The Allies did not fail because they lacked information. They failed because they actively ignored the information that contradicted their preconceived plan. Major Brian Urquhart, the Chief Intelligence Officer for the British 1st Airborne Division, had ordered low-level aerial reconnaissance flights over the Arnhem area in the days leading up to the drop. The resulting photographs clearly showed the unmistakable silhouettes of German armour hidden under camouflage netting in the woods. When Urquhart presented this hard, irrefutable photographic evidence to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, the deputy commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, Browning dismissed the photos, suggesting the tanks were likely broken down or obsolete. Urquhart was subsequently ordered to go on sick leave for nervous exhaustion. Furthermore, the top-secret Ultra intercepts, the decrypted German radio traffic from Bletchley Park, explicitly placed the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in the exact vicinity of the drop zones. This catastrophic arrogance is chillingly identical to the intelligence failure at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was repeatedly warned by his Native American scouts that the encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors was massive, far larger than any force the 7th Cavalry could handle. Custer, blinded by his own ambition and a supreme underestimation of his enemy's combat capability, ignored the scouts, divided his command, and rode directly into total annihilation. Montgomery and his staff committed the exact same sin of hubris in 1944, assuming the German army was a spent force and bending the intelligence to fit a wildly optimistic timeline. When you tailor the intelligence to fit the operation rather than tailoring the operation to fit the intelligence, you are writing a blank check that will be cashed in the blood of your infantry. The second massive failure of Market Garden was rooted in the unforgiving mathematics of logistics and aerial resupply. An airborne division is a highly specialized, incredibly expensive asset, but it has no logistical tail. Once dropped, it carries about 2 to 3 days of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. After that, it must be relieved by ground forces or resupplied from the air. Because 30 Corps was stalled on Hell's Highway, the British at Arnhem desperately needed aerial resupply. But the drop zones they had originally secured had been overrun by the advancing German forces. The British paratroopers, trapped in an ever-shrinking perimeter in the town of Oosterbeek, just west of Arnhem, tried to signal the incoming Royal Air Force supply planes using coloured smoke and radio beacons. But the radios, operating on the wrong frequencies and blocked by the heavily wooded terrain, failed completely. The RAF pilots, flying unarmoured Douglas Dakotas and short Stirlings, flew straight and level at 1,000 feet through a maelstrom of German anti-aircraft fire. The courage of these aircrews was absolute, holding their formations while their planes caught fire and their wings were shredded by 20mm flak. The dispatchers stood in the open doorways of burning aircraft, manually pushing heavy supply panniers out into the sky. But because the communication had broken down, the pilots were dropping the supplies on the pre-planned drop zones, which were now swarming with German troops. The British paratroopers watched in starving, ammunition-depleted agony as hundreds of tons of food, medical supplies, and precious ammunition drifted down under brightly coloured parachutes directly into the hands of the SS. It was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. You can have the bravest pilots and the best supply chain in the world, but if your tactical communication fails at the last mile, you are simply operating a highly efficient delivery service for the enemy. This leads us to the fatal flaw of the ground offensive, Operation Garden, and the absolute strategic lunacy of relying on a single axis of advance. Hell's Highway was exactly that, a 64-mile, two-lane elevated road surrounded by terrain that was completely impassable for heavy armor. In military strategy, a single line of communication is known as a single point of failure. If the enemy cuts the road at any point, the entire offensive stops dead. The Germans, commanded by the brilliant tactician Walther Model, realized this immediately. They didn't need to defeat 30 Corps in a pitched battle. They just needed to sever the artery. German Kampfgroups continuously launched flanking attacks against the highway, cutting the road, destroying supply trucks, and forcing the Allied armor to turn around and fight rearguard actions just to keep the supply lines open. This vulnerability draws a direct parallel to the agonizing plight of the United States 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War in 1950. The Marines were pushed deep into the frozen mountains of North Korea, relying on a single, narrow, winding dirt road as their main supply route, or MSR. When massive numbers of Chinese infantry infiltrated the mountains and cut the MSR in multiple places, the Marines found themselves surrounded, cut off, and fighting for their very survival in sub-zero temperatures. The terrain dictated that they could only move along that one road, turning their withdrawal into a brutal running gauntlet of fire. Whether it is the frozen mountains of Korea or the muddy polders of the Netherlands, chaining a mechanized army to a single road is a recipe for operational paralysis and catastrophic casualties. The terrain will always dictate the tactics, and ignoring the terrain is a fatal error. So why was this deeply flawed, incredibly risky operation greenlit in the first place? To understand that, we have to pull back and look at the multidimensional chessboard of politics, economics, and supreme command. By September 1944, the Allied High Command was a political powder keg. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and American Lieutenant General George S. Patton despised each other, constantly competing for glory, fuel, and the ear of Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Montgomery, traditionally a cautious and methodical commander, pitched this wildly out-of-character, high-risk gamble because it guaranteed that his 21st Army Group would receive the lion's share of the desperately limited Allied fuel and supplies, effectively halting Patton's Third Army in its tracks. But there was also immense pressure from Washington and London regarding the First Allied Airborne Army. This massive force of highly trained paratroopers and glider infantry represented a staggering economic investment. Training a paratrooper cost the United States government significantly more than training a standard infantryman. They required specialized gear, jump pay, thousands of transport aircraft, and massive logistical support just to keep them on standby in England. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, were practically demanding that Eisenhower use this expensive asset. You cannot justify keeping an elite army of 50,000 men sitting in barracks reading newspapers while the rest of the military is bleeding in the mud. The political capital required to keep them grounded had run out. Market Garden was, in many ways, an operation looking for a justification, a strategic hammer desperately searching for a nail. Furthermore, there was the genuine, intoxicating belief that the war could be won by Christmas. The German army appeared to be in a total rout. The Allied industrial machine, while producing staggering amounts of materiel, was straining under the logistical nightmare of moving it all across France. If Montgomery could punch a hole over the Rhine River, outflank the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, and drive British and American armour directly into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland that produced the steel and coal for the German war machine, the Third Reich would collapse. The economic strangulation of Germany would be complete. It was a gamble of epic proportions, rolling the iron dice with the lives of 50,000 elite airborne troops. But war is a dynamic, living entity, and the enemy gets a vote. The German army, backed into a corner, fighting on the very borders of their homeland, found a resilience that Allied intelligence completely failed to predict. By September 25th, the brutal reality could no longer be ignored. 10th Corps was halted just miles south of Arnhem, unable to break through the final German defensive screens. The British 1st Airborne Division, trapped in the Oosterbeek perimeter, was out of food, out of anti-tank ammunition, and taking horrific casualties from relentless artillery barrages. Under the cover of darkness and a torrential downpour, the order was given for Operation Berlin, the evacuation of the surviving British paratroopers across the lower Rhine. Leaving their wounded behind in the cellars with medical personnel, the exhausted, starving men slipped down to the riverbank and were ferried across in small canvas boats by British and Canadian engineers. Of the over 10,000 men of the British 1st Airborne Division and the Polish Brigade who had dropped into Arnhem, less than 3,000 made it back across the river. The division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had succeeded in capturing their objectives, securing the bridges at Eindhoven, Grave, and Nijmegen. But they were forced to remain in the line as standard infantry for months, fighting in the freezing mud of the Netherlands, bleeding combat power they could not easily replace. Operation Market Garden was a strategic failure of massive proportions. The Allies had driven a 64-mile salient into German lines, but the ultimate prize, the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem, remained firmly in German hands. The war would not end by Christmas. The failure of Market Garden gave the German military the breathing room it desperately needed to regroup, refit, and prepare for their massive winter counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The cost of Market Garden was staggering. The Allies suffered over 17,000 casualties in just 9 days of fighting, a heavier toll than the massive amphibious invasion of Normandy. It proved that elite light infantry, no matter how brave or well-trained, cannot hold ground indefinitely against heavy mechanized armor without immediate relief. It proved that complex operations, relying on perfect weather and perfect timing, are doomed to fail when exposed to the chaotic friction of combat. And it proved that ignoring intelligence to fit a desired narrative is the fastest way to get your soldiers killed. War is not a movie. It is a brutal, unforgiving ledger written in blood, steel, and the cold consequences of human error. It is a crucible where the brilliance of a plan is instantly shattered by the violent reality of the enemy's will to survive. We study these battles not to glorify the slaughter, but to understand the grim mechanics of command, the limitations of technology, and the incredible, tragic endurance of the men on the ground who pay the price for the lines drawn on a map. Now I want to hear your tactical assessment of this massive historical gamble. What do you believe was the single most critical factor that caused Operation Market Garden to fail? A. The catastrophic failure of Allied intelligence to acknowledge the presence of the SS Panzer divisions. B. The flawed strategy of relying on a single elevated highway for the armored relief column. C. The fundamental weakness of airborne doctrine when facing heavy mechanized armor. Sound off in the comments below with your choice and your reasoning. Make sure to hit that subscribe button to keep this military history channel locked and loaded, and we will see you on the next battlefield.